my background is I'm an engineer by training, and I've always been involved with tech companies. And I've been a CEO of energy businesses, so I have a special interest in climate and ESG. So I think we'll start with asking Rich and Justin to give a little bit of background on them, and then we'll get started.
All right. Thank you. I'm happy to kick us off today. So my name is Rich Goode. I'm a partner here at PwC. I'm based in Boston. I'm on the East Coast. Just a little bit about my background. I've been in Big Four professional services, all sustainability, ESG for the last dozen years. Prior to that, I was Chief Sustainability Officer at a big French telecom company called Alcatel. So I was their first ever head of global sustainability there, got to build that plan from that program from scratch. So I like to say that I've had experience from both sides of the table, from the client side and the consultant side. Just technical specialties. We're going to talk a little bit about greenhouse gases and climate risk today. Those are my technical specialties. They make up the backbone of a lot of these rules we'll be talking about. And in my extracurricular, I am a member of the teaching staff at Harvard University, where I teach a few classes on climate risk and global climate emissions. So great to be with you here today. Turn over to my colleague and friend, Justin.
Yeah, hey everybody, welcome. And for those, I spent time with you on the rooftop last time. I thoroughly enjoyed that as well, and looking forward to picking up this conversation. For any of you that were there in the other discussion, hopefully you're expecting and feel comfortable asking any type of questions while we're always prepared to go through, the substance of what's happening in the laws. What does this mean? Of course, I think what's so interesting about your group specifically is the range of issues that you have to consider for the companies you advise. So I always like to ask the so what question, 2 to 3 times, and I think we'll try to get into some of those things today beyond just what is going on in the data, what are the rules require us to disclose, but what does this mean for maybe our strategy? What does this mean in terms of a refresh, in terms of how we're thinking about all our investments in the space? What does this mean if we set an ambitious goal and now we have to give more detail on how we're getting to the goal? Do we feel like that creates some exposure? Should we be more conservative in what we state publicly in our goals and our marketing and all those types of other questions that I've had with individual management teams and some board members, and Rich has too. Just to give a little bit more background myself, but I live in Silicon Valley. I work with a lot of the companies out here. Really, I'll just call broadly everything around transformation, either because it's a business model change within the company or some type of external factor that's either regulation or market conditions or otherwise that require businesses to adjust strategy all the way through. How does that strategy manifest through operations, the people within in the organization, and the data, and ultimately the reporting? And so this is a topic that hits all of those nerves, and there's continues to be a lot of interest and investment, and given all the speed of regulation, it's one that is top of mind with a lot of the board members that we work with. So looking forward to the discussion. And we know Emily is not holding any punches on softball questions.
Yeah. So, I don't even think you need me. I think you do know exactly what we're interested in, but all the same, I've got to start off. I think I'm interested in just a high level, concise view, just the headlines, right? Of what are the key, but based the expectations and all the thoughts we thought might come out with these climate regs. What actually are the SEC rules, and what do they mean for a board member?
Sure. I'll quickly hit some of the key changes. A lot of the things with the draft rule that issuers were worried about was scope 3 or supply chain emissions, and they've been removed completely. So there's no obligation to report scope 3 supply chain emissions. Timing, the timing has been adjusted. So you're in scope your first fiscal year following 1/1/2025. Now, many of you are already aware that the rule has been temporarily stayed by the Fifth Circuit. It's going to go through various appeals and such. But generally, our general counsel here at PwC feels that even if these rules don't get ironed out till November or December of this year, the SEC will not be so kind as to say, well, I'll give you another year of compliance. We're expecting this to be in effect 1/1/25. So the scope 3 is the first thing. They've also bumped out in your first year, you don't have to even put in your scope 1 or 2 or your operational greenhouse gas emissions. Those wait till 2026. Assurance deadlines are also pushed out, with reasonable assurance not occurring till 2027 and or limited assurance 2027 and reasonable all the way up to 2030. So you've got a lot of time before this is getting under assurance scrutiny. The other thing that issuers were worried about was timing, meaning I'm going to have to issue and report with assurance my greenhouse gas emissions at the same timing as my 10K. That is a heavy lift for a lot of companies. The technology is just not there to do it. So they actually allow companies to follow up with greenhouse gas accounting in your assurance statement in your second quarter Q filing. So you get that more 6 months. And I think the final piece that people were really worried about was indeed the 1% threshold on any cost or revenue impacts on any financial statement line item. We felt the SEC was going to change and give a 5% or allow management to decide, but what they did is they focused exclusively on operating profit, but they kept the 1% threshold. So while it's only one financial statement line item, operating profit that's really impacted here, you could see a situation in the future, hypothetical, where a company had recorded $20 million in operating profit, but had and had a $22 million climate impact for some reason. And that would be exclusively the thing to push them into a loss-making position. So the SEC sort of had a gotcha there with that one, because that operating profit number can be really big, it can be really small too. So that sort of summarizes the big things, but happy to take other questions, of course, as we've discussed.
Okay. Justin, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I think, one of the other things just to be mindful of here, in the context of discussing SEC, and as Rich mentioned, there's a few key things that maybe make these less intimidating than certainly March 2022. I remember when the proposals came out, and that really sent off this catalytic fire. But in between those 2 years, we've had California pass a bill that does include Scope 3. We've got CSRD, right, in Europe, which many of the companies in the Valley here that represented by this group, will still be subject to, and that does still include more stringent requirements, reporting extent. So I do think it's really important, and to understand what these rules mean, but also to look at the entire disclosure package when you're thinking about, well, what does this mean in terms of, do we pause everything? Do we wait? I think, as Rich stated, well, number one, we can't wait, because even if the stay has some permanence or the rules change, the timelines for the SEC remain the same. But at the same time, if you're going to have to be reporting things in Europe, et cetera, it's hard to slow the train down, or it's probably ill-advised to be ready, or to not be ready to basically do the things that a lot of the original proposals included.
Mm-hmm. So since you're talking to the Northern California section of NACD, can you say a little bit more about the California regs? I don't want to get too far off the SEC things, but I think that's, now that we've all heard that, what does that mean to us? Is that timing sooner? So I don't know if Rich, you want to.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off on that. So California actually has three separate regulations. One is in effect already. Well, they're all approved, right? But the compliance deadline for one, AB 1305, if your company buys carbon offsets in pursuit of achieving a product carbon neutral claim, or the company is carbon neutral or net zero, and you're buying offsets in pursuit of that, you're responsible for it's not a very robust disclosure. It's a one-pager. It's not even subject to assurance. Basically says, here's the offsets we buy. Here are the registration numbers. Here's when they're retired. So it's a light lift, but it is in scope today. And that's one of those things that a lot of companies aren't even aware that they're subject to. The two bigger ones, 253 and 261, SB 253, 261, and they basically focus on two things. 253 is the greenhouse gas rule, where it's scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions with assurance submitted to the California Air Resource Board, starting in 2026. Now, CARB has until 2026 to establish their directory, their mechanism, the how-to, so nobody knows how to. But for the most part, what we've gleaned from the rule is if your company already calculates its greenhouse gas emissions and has it assured, then that is going to be perfectly reasonable to comply with that part of the California rule. The second rule is climate-related risk. And I want to just spend an extra second on this one. Climate-related risk, that is the backbone of CSRD, the European Union, the ISSB, the international one that's with IFRS right now, the SEC rule, and now the California rule, and New York has even have a proposed rule. It leverages the framework called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. No tests on this, TCFD. That is the only global framework that companies can use to follow the process to determine whether or not they have climate risk. And if so, is it material? That is such an important thing for all of these regulations. And personally, my biggest shock at how few companies have actually undertaken a robust and complete climate assessment. Because if I were on the board of directors, even without having a regulation to drive this, I would want to know, are there things about our business, about our strategy, about our supply chain that are subject to climate risk, a material climate risk that we should be managing just like other risks? You don't have to believe in climate change to think that my business could be impacted by an event like this. So understanding that that event could happen and putting in place mitigation efforts to reduce the likelihood and impact is just part of management, whether it's a climate risk or a currency risk or a competitive risk.
Okay. So thanks. You mentioned materiality, and I'd like you to dig a little deeper into this 1% threshold so we can all understand how. I know that's part of the SEC climate rules, but you mentioned, and of course, materiality. The double materiality is a big thing in Europe. So those of us who have companies that operate in Europe, but even the SEC rules have something about materiality. So can you discuss that and what that would mean to a board, or how that would affect how we think about things?
So I like to use the phrase, capital M and small m, material and material, right? The European Union rule, when you mentioned double materiality, there are hundreds of topics that come out, and using the EU language, the CSRD language, they're called material topics. But as an accountant or someone in the US used to working with the SEC, material with the SEC, I use the capital M. That's a big deal. Now, what the SEC is looking for is not a list of material impacts, risks, or opportunities. That's what the European Union is looking for. But rather, they're looking for, with a narrative around the climate assessment. And here's where the board's role comes in. Has there been a robust climate assessment done that and we understand the issues and the impacts that we need to manage? And are any of those issues and impacts material? And if it's truly a material risk, it should be treated like all other material risks with SOX level documentation and controls and all of those other things. Now, that's not to say that every company should have or will have a material climate risk. You're a software company, your data centers are managed by AWS, you're really just office buildings. Do you have a material climate risk? Quite unlikely. Now, if you're a steel manufacturer with all those carbon emissions, or you're an automotive company or transportation, logistics, you have a lot more climate-related risk. Similarly, if you're a manufacturer with large extended supply chains, we're at the point now where a volcano somewhere remote can actually impact supply chains all the way across the world. The bridge collapse that just happened this week in Baltimore, that tragedy, that will impact our economy significantly. It's not a climate-related risk, but you could see like how one isolated event has these global ripples across the supply chain.
Okay, but what about the materiality level? Because there's a lot of, we talk about, in financial terms, right? Financial is if it would affect an investor's decision, right? Yeah. Is that, how do we think about that with climate? When you say, is it material? What is it? What makes it material?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because the SEC is basically giving you an opportunity to make the case that climate, meaning the greenhouse gas emissions, is not material for your company. Now, with the EU, they also give you the same opportunity to make a case, but it's almost more work to argue that it's not material than to just report on it. But with the SEC, I was having a conversation with a colleague in our Governance Insight Center, and we were talking about this very topic. And his view was, look, if you sort of built a flow chart and ask questions like, have our investors ever asked about sustainability, ESG, or climate? Have we ever had an issue, a Superfund site, a toxic waste cleanup? Do we carry a lot of environmental liabilities on our balance sheet? Do we have customers that or products that have green claims associated with them? If you had no, and you'd really done the homework that you could bring to someone, an auditor, and show that, look, these are just not important. Climate is not material to us. You could make that case. Now, you have to believe it. It has to pass a red face test. It has to pass an auditor's view as well. But they are giving you that escape clause. And to me, my view is certain industries, climate is not a material risk.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Justin, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, I think building off, Rich, right, about the physical risk, right? We hit on some of that. Hey, there's a volcano, there's a hurricane, there's, extensive flash flooding from water, there's drought, certainly the impacts of those, I think, can be more extensive than maybe people meets the surface. So it's not just like, what's the damage to the buildings and infrastructure, and affected geo areas, which if you see some of the modeling around it, it's actually a pretty cool use of AI and statistics that it goes far beyond my brain power. But it's also like the secondary and tertiary effects, right, of access to people and resources and talent in a lot of those impacted areas as well. But beyond the physical risk, I think, Rich, he said it, but about, like the competitive risk, I think it's the transition risk, right? And trying to anticipate if customer preferences change, like, do we need to move? Like, it's one thing to say, hey, we are, like, if you're in fossil fuels, right? Obviously there's a massive transition risk, potentially, as preferences, regulations, taxes, and other things make it very expensive or potentially, difficult to operate altogether. And in some point in the future, we've been in this discussion. So again, I stick on the energy sector, where I don't think it's that intensive in this group, but just as an example, when we think about, hey, a lot of these companies have come out and stated, hey, we're transitioning to, non-carbon combustion. We're transitioning to, hydrogen, energy efficiency. And it sort of begs the question, well, what does that mean about the monetization of their assets? Right? They get billions and billions of assets that do fossil fuel combustion. And does that mean that those should be written off? And what's the risk on the, on the value of some of those things? So I think when we think about risk, it's not just what are the impacts that environmental things physically impact our current business assets, but what is this whole, stream of regulation, competitors making movements, companies changing their supply chains, companies changing their products, particularly the ones that compete with us. How do we foresee that requiring us to spend more money to stay relevant, to change our products, to change our business, to change our supply chain? And that calculation gets more, complicated than I think people appreciate, and the assumptions that go into it. And I would just think, as a board member, it's interesting to understand, to Rich's point, maybe a management team says, this is not material, this is much ado about nothing. We'll figure out how to get the data together for the disclosure requirement, but otherwise, like, full steam ahead. I think just understanding the assumptions they've made, to get to that conclusion is really important. And to Rich's point, it almost becomes, and this is my advice to management, not suggesting that you should say this is material, but I think you want to say, look, in our industry and whatever, here's like the 5 or 6 areas around climate that we think could be the most impactful or most important. This is our view on each of them. And this is why we choose not to do really anything or put our capital, time, resources into some of these areas, minus we're going to get this disclosure together. And as long as it's well constructed and thought out and is informed, it could be the right conclusion. Because the other part of this, and when I say the practical discussion here, is we're not suggesting everyone go out and spend a ton of money to be the best reporter, mm-hmm. or the greenest products, or et cetera, right? It is a set of business decisions, just like every other business decision around investment, whether that's investment in reporting, investment in the technology to do analytics and forecast data, whether it's financial data or climate, or it's what do we want to continue to do in this space. I think I think one of the changes we've seen in the recent years is, even because it's even under the ESG and climate umbrella, having a shrewd business case on everything that we're doing is required. And I think there was probably a period of time where it was just maybe more generally understood that we had to be doing these things, and maybe a little bit less of a stringent business case. I know when we talk with some of the sustainability folks and teams, that's some of our advice is you guys need to think a little bit more, critically like a business person. Your presentations can't frame these investments like charitable contributions, can't frame them like, hey, it's all about just goodwill, brand building. That's obviously impactful to us. We're seeing a lot more scrutiny and stringency on, everything around here, including the investments and the reporting as a result.
Thanks. Sorry. I have one question, and then I want to get into case studies because our time is going quickly. So my sort of practical question, thinking about what you've both said about materiality and all these things, is, there's at least, I think, three sort of general ways companies could decide, right, to go on climate, right? One is they could be a leader, support to their brand, support to their employees and their stakeholders, and they're out there trying new things and making it work. There's a second group that is concerned about compliance. They want to make the rules. They want to meet their duty of compliance, of obedience, and they'll do what they need to do to answer that. And then there's a third group that might say, you know what, what's the penalty, right? I mean, what if we don't do this? That's a business decision you can make because you've got what you think is other more important priorities in your business. So can you answer? I think the first two we're understanding, right? If you want to be out front, what's it to be a leader? If you want to comply, and meet the the hurdle, you'll do that. And then, but what about that third group? Not all boards and management are in agreement about how important this is.
It's such a good and Rich. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. Nope.
Rich, maybe let me say one comment on that. And then Rich, please, I want you to feel that question. But Emily, I think it's such a good and the right question to ask. One thing I would just caution on, or one advice I would have from any board to management is, first of all, like, let's make sure we inventory not just what we're going to say in this disclosure, but let's inventory all of the disclosures we've made across our company, because this is where I think companies can get into trouble and they don't realize it. Like, if we have a bank covenant that ties an interest rate to some certain performance around climate or ESG, which several companies do, particularly in this market, we've got some companies that have multi-billion-dollar bonds associated with meeting certain covenants. So we have to think about, as this additional disclosure, like, are we being consistent with what we've tied to there? So I think that's one set of stakeholders. Obviously, if we've made any public claims in our marketing or branding, et cetera, around it, we need to be thoughtful about what, even if we say, hey, we want to invest the minimum on this disclosure, like, we need to make sure that we don't get accused of greenwashing, right? Because it's not just it's a brand hit. We've seen regulators come after things. We've seen companies have to recuse statements around their labels and things. So I think you've got to think about all of the access to capital that maybe is already tied into things. I think you've got to think about all the customer commitments, and then, I think about taxation and authorities. We're going to have to potentially do more, around that space. So our disclosures, we need to be consistent. We wouldn't want to say one thing high level here and then do another thing when it comes down to pay some type of carbon tax, and, which are growing and, in other places. So I think just getting the full inventory of all of the disclosures and commitments that we're making. I think companies that are not at least consistent with methodology and assumptions that they're thinking about here, could find themselves in, some precarious situations. But Rich, go ahead. That withstanding, maybe answer the question to Emily directly, because I think it's the right question.
Yeah. So I do have clients. I have one client that they said, our goal is to be the best, most complete, and most trusted sustainability reporter in the world. Right. And they're putting the time, effort, and resources behind that. But to your specific question, Emily, what about the people that are not even meaty part of the curve? Like, can I just delay this? I don't really have to do this. What's the minimum? There's the two viewpoints here. One is, we've got so many other priorities. I just don't even have time to think about this. But the other is looking at it from an informed perspective, not really knowing that they're even in scope. I talked to a colleague. There's a German supply chain law that the first due date was, I don't know, like January 1st, 2024, and only 10% of impacted companies actually responded. And a lot of it came from, oh, I didn't know, right? But specifically that companies of let's just call them climate laggards, right? Look, I spend half my time being a consultant and the other half being a therapist, taking leaders of companies through their 5 stages of grief, shock, denial, anger, depression, acceptance, about these rules and the fact that it does apply to them. And then, yes, it's a ton of work. And I will just leave I'll have some other takeaways at the end, but this is a lot of work, even if you don't want to do it. The fines range from percentage of operating profit. So Germany has come up 4% for their forestry rule, 4% of your operating profit. Jail time for directors. I mean, they're trying to mimic Exchange Act of 34 type penalties, which are no joke. That's why the SEC rule, even though watered down, remains an SEC disclosure with legal liability for you all and management. So that's why it's being taken so seriously. And there are significant penalties that go along with it. But I always have to say, look, and I think this is a good segue to our case studies. You have people work to do, you have process work to do, and you have technology work to do. And it doesn't matter if you just want to barely comply or be the leader. The work is similar. It's just how robust is it? You still have to do these things.
And I think just one other add on that. I think there's how much do we want to disclose, right? So I could be, determined I don't want it to be on the front end of far more disclosure than my peers are stating. But I do think the understanding of the information, to Rich's point, irrespective of all that, is really important. Otherwise, it just limits all the decisions and other things that we want to make. We want to make in this area. And I go back to just the management team. Like, I think this is not just the reporting. Reporting is the reason that we're talking about this right now. And what are we going to disclose? I do think it goes back to the strategy overall, which is, do we want to be a leader? How much do we think this is differentiating us? Do we want to just kind of do the minimum so that we're not accused publicly of being someone who doesn't care about the environment or our communities in which we operate? Or do we want to try to find a safe space? Certainly, some management teams and companies have determined that this will differentiate their product. Or, if you look at like the cloud space, look at what like the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsoft, I mean, they are all up in here making massive multi-billion-dollar commitments. Obviously, they think that that's what they need to do to compete against each other, but to win in the long-term future. That's kind of one extreme, and then you can go to the other extreme, which certainly there are a lot of companies, particularly some of the private companies I'm working with, that are looking to go public, who are more focused on their burn rate, and any investment that decreases or increases their burn rate, even they can say, hey, but look, we think we're leading in climate. Like, they don't think their investors are going to take that, right. They're going to say, you should have protected your burn. You should have protected your cost. So I really think the question on this is, what's our strategy around broader ESG, but specifically climate? And then work back to, the reporting and what we did in terms of deploy. So again, if my strategy is I want to lead in climate because people will pick my product versus others, I may want to use this opportunity to say more than some others. I think the last thing I'll just say is what we don't know, and Rich, feel free to chime in. We don't know what it means to renege on a publicly stated climate goal, right? We know a lot of companies in this market and across the world I'll call it like the pledge. Hey, we're going to do everything we can, net zero. Let's avoid the 1.5 degree increase. We know, and you guys know probably from your companies, but Rich and I certainly say all the time, those pledges were made without like anything that would really be a bona fide plan. Yeah. So what's my exposure? Do I use this opportunity now that I've got to start disclose more high level how I'm executing against that plan? Is it better to be more conservative? We've seen a couple companies walk it back. Is it better to extend the timeline and just say, hey, we're evaluating many things? I saw a question in the chat about AI. I don't think a lot of companies that are planning to use AI at scale have thought about what this really means to their, emissions from the energy consumption, et cetera. It's a great question. And there's all these sort of variables that make it really difficult, I think, for us to forecast in this space. Yet we've set these aggressive goals that imply a lot of operational change that could be very expensive. So I just think it's going back to always having a cohesive strategy, number one, that we're intentful on how we think our business plays. Number two, again, like I said earlier, was having a clear inventory of all our disclosures in this space. So we're at least being consistent. Even if we're not disclosing that much, we're not saying something over here and then saying something totally different in our branding. One other example is like officers' goals. We've seen a lot of companies start to tie officers' comp into climate goals. Well, we don't certainly want to now disclose something publicly to the SEC or otherwise that shows our emissions increased while we paid out all our officers really well for hitting their climate goal. You can see that creating a lot of scrutiny and subject. So again, I just think doing that inventory where we're consistent, having a strategy on where we need to play in this place will help form, how much investment, how much we discern to disclose, whether we want to be a leader or middle of the pack.
Great. Thank you. So I want to keep going. So first of all, thank you for the questions in the chat. We are looking at them, and Rich, thank you for responding to the ones you can, because everybody can read those now, and we can, hopefully get through more. But I do want to get some case studies. So, did each of you bring a case study with you as your homework?
It did indeed. So I will choose this first one. So I had mentioned in the beginning that whether you're seeking to be the best in the world or just get me out of this mess, it's people, process, and technology. So we're working with a global beverage manufacturer, and in doing a current state assessment, anytime there was a sustainability report that had to go out, and this is voluntary, so we're not even talking with significant amounts of assurance behind it. There were 131 people that touched that report. And of that 131 people, an overwhelming majority of them did not have it as part of their official day-to-day responsibilities. They were sort of ad hoc best efforts. By focusing first on the people aspect, how are you organized for success? Because the client had said the main sticking point was every time there's a disclosure or a sustainability report, it's a nightmare. It's late hours, hurt feelings, frustration, no access to data. Very, very difficult. We basically created an interim state and the future state, calling a COE, a Center of Excellence, staffed with 2 people running voluntary reporting, 3 people running mandatory reporting, underlaid by a small project management organization, and then using the company's, what they're called, shared service centers, to collect data with dedicated specialists. The end result was they ended up with 13 people full-time in their center of excellence, and then a smaller handful of dedicated operators in each region. So they went from having 131 people down to 13. And then on the technology piece, all of the work was manual. Even a big Fortune 50 company like this, a lot of their data gathering for greenhouse gas, truck mileage, refrigerants, things like that was all overwhelmingly manual, and reporting took a long time. So the technology piece was using a last mile reporting solution. A lot of companies use Workiva for financial reporting. They have an ESG or sustainability reporting tool as well. And that's just one. Audit board's another one, but using these last mile reporting tools to keep track of information, because some of the questions in the sidebar you're noticing are, what about other regs? What about, am I going to be issuing 40 or 50 reports? Maybe. And the only way to do that without having to hire 50 people that probably whose skills don't exist, is technology. Using a data lake with tagging, so that whatever software you have, if it's CSRD, SEC, ISSB, LMNOP, whatever reporting format you're going for, it's there. And it's a data challenge, getting the data in the right place so you can report on it. That's sort of my case study there. That's through the combination of organizing a center of excellence along with the judicious use of technology. And those people in the towers now, the COE, can build the controls. That's a process piece. So people, process, technology, I like to keep that in mind, because you can throw more people at it, but they have to have the capability, and they likely need to be augmented by technology. Sometimes it's a simple decision to, I'm going to hire 20 people, or am I going to buy this piece of software? and the software is oftentimes a better investment. So, Justin, I'm interested in hearing your case study.
Yeah, I will. And I want to hit just one question too that Christine put in here. I think it's a really good one. She says, if you walk back carbon neutral goal and your way to achieve it is carbon offsets, they might be less expensive 5 years from now. So a cost savings, I would expect some rationalization to occur. This is part of the point I'm making. And look, I am, again, regardless of your views, or take politics, take emotion out of it. And you really, when you start to think about the business, I think that's what's really interesting is when you look at the goal setting. I think the goal setting is something that was largely done in the past, maybe without a ton of rationalization. But what does it mean if I set a goal for 2030, 2040, 2050? Think about even sequestration costs. I mean, it's not unfeasible. And I like to take extreme, scenarios because they highlight the point, regardless of maybe the level of chance it happens. But in one extreme scenario, you can imagine a company saying, "Hey, look, we're going to be, carbon neutral by 2050, but we're going to defer our progress, kind of like a slow on ramp, and then hit more of it at the end because we think the cost of sucking it back out of the atmosphere is going to be a lot cheaper. We think carbon offsets market will be more stable." You could also argue that the carbon offsets purchased today, there's a lot of questions in some of those markets around how credible those credits are, right? You hear about things as it's the farm in Mexico, and are they awarding that credit to multiple companies, et cetera. So I do think that's some of the great questions that you can ask is, why have we set a 2030 goal versus 2040 versus 25 versus 2050? And what does that do to the costs of our transition? And that gets me onto my use case, which is sort of relevant. So I have a company in the Valley who I would say they don't view that climate risk as material. Like, in other words, they didn't view that it was going to have negative impacts. But they do a lot of projects around climate. So they had they have a lot of projects that include certain things. So they're construction, one of the largest real estate. And basically, to Rich's point, one of their things was they had climate data all over the place. It was reactive for reporting, and they thought that was going to be basically okay. One of the problems was they got really, some inconsistent methods between things they were doing for local countries, one off, and it grew to be really inefficient and really inconsistent. But the other thing was it was really difficult to do any type of, I would say, forward-looking forecast for purposes of, because they did have a climate goal, right? And their board pushed them to say, are we going to hit this? And if not, what's the risk, right? It was a simple question. And the reality was it was really difficult to forecast what that information was going to be like in the future. And so it started with that question from the board. And what happened in getting a better set of processes and data to be able to forecast, it helped them inform, the strategy on the different levers they pull to get there. But also when they said, look, we could get there, but this is what it costs. But if certain assumptions change, we may change. Like, in other words, I talked about AI earlier. If AI, which we believe is productive to our business, is going to increase emissions 30%, we need to evaluate what the cost is of offsetting that incremental energy consumption than what we had before. So the company basically decided they needed to invest in data, not just to deal with these disclosures, like certainly that was a positive outcome, but to actually be able to project emissions in the futures to make decisions. And the side benefit that they didn't intend at the time was when the IRA came out, right? So the the Reduction Act from the IRS, which provided a lot of billions of dollars of incentives, they actually are now able to make decisions around projects and capital intensive investments to be able to take advantage of those credits, which they weren't able to do before. So I just think it's not just about getting the better data and ecosystems that Rich mentioned, centralized data for purpose of reporting. I think if you need to do anything in this space, which is going to be most companies, there's an ROI if you think about all those other things you need to be able to do: project, make climate decisions, be able to take advantage of tax incentives, and be able to consider all of these things when some business assumption is going to change, which business and environment is going to continue to be dynamic.
Okay, thank you. So let's, I always like to know your thoughts about what are good questions for board directors to ask the management team, especially, if they want to just have an opinion about how is management doing on this? How's their disclosure strategy, their readiness to comply? What's a helpful way for directors to ask?
Because I've been sort of surprised by the amount of companies that have not undertaken an official climate risk assessment. A simple question would be, do we have any material climate risks? And then how do you know that? Is it just nothing to see here? Because that's not acceptable. You have to do the work. If you were the smartest kid in your algebra class and you knew the answer to the question, you could just write down 17 or y equals 6. Great. You only got half credit because your teacher needs to see that you understand and did the homework. That's the same way here. So many companies are going to be in a very difficult position when it comes time for disclosures because they haven't done any work around truly understanding and assessing if they have climate-related risk. Not only for the regulatory compliance piece, because it's good to know. It's just, we live in a changing climate all the time. Does it impact my business? And if so, is it in a material way that I should manage and do something differently? That would be my first question. Do we have a material risk, and how do you know that?
So for companies that don't have a chief sustainability officer, right? How do you recommend that work can get done? Someone with the company, some outside the company. What's the not just getting that first materiality assessment done or whatever it is, but to make sure the company learns at the same time?
We're seeing the advent of a new role called an ESG controller. More and more of our clients are hiring people, and I call them true unicorns, right? They typically come from the financial reporting space, maybe the controllership function, internal audit, and they've deliberately upskilled on sustainability. They learned about carbon accounting and climate risk and all these regulations. That's still a very much a unicorn position, but people like that exist. I like to say the big four are unicorn factories because we take people from audit and train them up on sustainability and get them out there. You can certainly go out for help. I often say, look, hiring a CSO is not magic. It doesn't solve all the issues. Sustainability can be managed by committee or COE, Center of Excellence, with people giving half or quarter time from different functions. It probably needs an executive leader, someone to do the drive and to ask hard questions. Do we have climate risk? What are our emissions? Are they going up or down? Should we reduce them? Those are the questions, and why, and how do you know that? Those are the kind of things that I think board members should really be asking.
So a term like an ESG controller, that sounds like it reports to the CFO. I mean, how do you see this organizationally fitting in?
Yeah, Justin, I'd be interested in your view on
this. I'll start, Rich, and maybe tell me, but Emily, you hit it. Particularly companies that have large ecosystems on the financial data side and have started to look at the topics that we talked about. What is the body of data that we're going to need? What does it mean going into a financial statement under, officer penalty? Like, what is a SOX, ready report for this information versus what we have? And it's a big lift, and it has driven the change in several organizations, including some of the most mature, to take this from sustainability team ownership, which has been largely probably gathering this data for the voluntary disclosures over the last, however, 5-10 years long we've been disclosing, and moving it into the CFO org. I mean, we've certainly see that as a major trend. And what's been interesting as Rich and I have navigated a lot of that, I'll just say it, cross overlap in terms of sharing responsibility. Like, they come at it from different approaches, right? And certainly, like, the SOX teams are thinking more about, how do I audit this? Where does this come from? What are the assumptions? What are the estimates? And again, it's no fault because this wasn't necessarily thought about it to that lens. But I do think from a financial reporting risk perspective, either having an ESG controller, or certainly having someone from the CFO org, from the controllership org, with accountability over this information going forward. And I would start that process now, even before, we actually have to file these in our regulatory reports. Like that's one good way to highlight the the exposures that we might have on controls and data and other perspective. But
Right.
Rich, please. Oh, good.
Well, I just want to challenge that a little bit, because as soon as it goes into the CFO world, it feels to me like compliance, and it feels less strategic. It feels less that the organization is embracing it. And I think particularly, we haven't really covered this yet, but when we think about how the climate regs fit into the bigger ESG story, right? When you've got all the people side, all the social, and governance pieces, that now it's just one more SOX. It's one more box on the audit committee list of things to do. I don't know. I don't know if others wanted to chime in on that, but that's my first reaction, is that's too bad, right? That is not where I'd like to see, all of this be.
And to be clear, and I'd love to look at the chat too, and Rich chime in, not to imply that sustainability moves under the CFO org, only that this now becomes just like any other thing in business. The strategy set by the C-suite, you have different people from risk and others opining on the strategy and making sure we're protected. Ultimately, that does get to a financial reporting function that has to make sure that, the data that we're releasing is accurate, useful, reliable, auditable. Right. And so the infrastructure that sits internally already around business strategy to reporting, obviously there's mechanisms and governance that you have in place. I actually think that's something that's a really important point that you bring up through that question, Emily, is we don't want to lose that focus. And I will tell you, Rich and I have spent time with these new SEC controllership groups, and they're like, this is kind of frustrating because these goals have been set, these goals have been marketed publicly. We're saying all these things in the C-suite. Our operations teams are separately doing all their stuff in operations. Yet here we are having to somehow figure out how to pull all the data, assure that it's ready, and kind of make sure all these things are together. They're like, we're the tail wagging the dog. What I would say is a best practice is, again, you usually start with some type of committee or steer code that includes these things. But anything we're doing on the reporting side for compliance, we should use to build a better data ecosystem to funnel to the C-suite. Mm-hmm. Hey, look, now that we've got all this climate data, which we've never had, it was just totally estimates up in the air. Look, we can give you some insights on the decisions that you're making at the board level or the C-suite level that might impact how you think about things. Just like you would any other financial decision, right? You go to the CFO, say, hey, we're thinking about going into this jurisdiction. We're thinking about doing this deal, buying this company. Well, imagine now you could think about, well, what does that mean from all sustainability and climate things that we do if we acquire this company or we go into this area? If we decide to offload this, we decide to make this big CapEx expenditure. So they need to stay connected. I think it's a great point, Emily. We're seeing this SEC ESG controller pop up, but it doesn't pop up with automatic alignment. And I do think that's an area of risk and unfortunacy in early stages. We need to get those things thinking together. So Rich, I don't know if you wanted to layer on.
No, I think you nailed it. Happy to move on to other questions.
Yeah, thanks. So what I'd like to do, maybe it's the most efficient thing, is if Rich and Justin, if you just want to look at the questions, because we've just got a few minutes left, and I want to give time for each of you to just kind of give some final thoughts as we leave. So let's say we've got 5 minutes. So if you look at them and, if you can easily respond like Rich has in some of them and
yeah, we're doing a little multitasking.
No, I appreciate it. But there are some great questions here.
Yeah, I mean,
but they need concise answers. That's all I'll say. So
yeah, and I would, if I could sort of summarize some of the questions, it's like, what about these other things like social rules or governance rules? What do I have to do as a director? And the SEC, the final rule still has language in there around what the board members are supposed to do. The final rule retains the requirement to disclose relevant expertise of management responsible for managing these risks. Now they have to, it does remove the requirement to disclose if any director has expertise. So directors, you all don't have to have climate expertise, but given that this has become a legitimate business risk, whether it's regulations or customers, as I had a client come to us last month and said, on one of the reporting and rankers, I think it's MSCI, said if you don't get a triple B or better, similar to bond ratings, AAA, AA, if you don't get triple B or better, we're not going to do business with you. Now, that's not a regulation. That's a customer requirement, because don't forget, customers in your company's supply chain, your company's customers, you may not have a robust or climate target or just want to kind of be a compliance But if you're selling to the Amazons and others of the world that want to be robust reporters, they can only get that by through working directly with you. So
Yeah.
I said in the very beginning, and then I'll shut up here, the direction of travel is full reporting on your environmental issues, wastewater, greenhouse gas, biodiversity loss, things like that. Social issues, how you treat your employees, how they're paid, male, female, gender issues, as well as workers in the supply chain, as well as how you as directors are providing oversight and governance of climate-related risks, or to determine whether or not they have climate-related risks. That's the direction of travel. There's going to be puts and takes on each individual rule, but reporting fully and transparently on those things is really just, it's here today.
Yep. And to pick up a couple, I saw one question on, hey, isn't our impact, a scope 3 for another company? And that's absolutely right. That's the point Rich made. So, for example, Walmart very publicly came out and they're trying to report on their entire supply chain. So maybe I'm someone who wasn't subject to these SEC rules, but hey, Walmart drives 80% of my revenues. They're my biggest customer. You can think about the buying power of some of these large organizations. Rich mentioned Amazon, and others that would make it so that if I want to sell my product to them and I have better information, or I am able to produce information that shows that I have a more friendly environmental impact, or lower supply chain risks, I have better working conditions, that may differentiate me, especially as they start to ask for this. So absolutely, interoperability between companies, and that's why scope 3 is so interesting, is really important to consider. I think that's a fair question to ask your management team, especially if you're maybe a private company that you sit on a board on, or someone who's otherwise saying we're not subject to this. There's another question about sharing information between companies. You're right. That is absolutely something that's being worked upon. I can tell you in a lot of procurement situations, we face this too. Procurement is now asking for this as part of, contracts, as part of, getting engaged. That's one way. What I have not seen yet, but there's been a part of some public consortiums on, this public exchange where everyone submits their data and we can get this global view to try to, make sure we're not double counting and all those types of things. I think more will come in terms of information exchange between companies. For right now, it's pretty much, one-to-one sharing of customers and businesses that work together. Rich, any other questions you see? Let me scan through.
No, I think we're kind of caught up here.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all the comments. Thank you. And I can see we've got a lot of folks very deep into this, right? So, in answer to Lisa's comment about, additional ESG cohort where we get, much more detailed into things, please let us know, let Lisa know ideas for that. Because I can, just from your questions here, I think we can already see some important follow-up meetings we might have on this cohort. So, okay, we've got a couple minutes left. So each of you have a minute. So for any final thoughts to help these directors be as effective as possible in the boardroom, on everything, but especially
I've gone
this
first
question.
every time. So you go ahead first.
Okay, Justin, you're first.
Yeah, I think just the number one thing is of course acknowledging, you're going to have questions around, what do these rules mean to us? Do we have exposures from commitments we've already made, from things we've said to, again, customers, banks? So I think outside of getting through to, is there a risk or exposure here? I really think re-challenging management. Don't tell them I told you to do this. I'll have a lot of my current clients mad at me, but re-challenging management on the strategy, on what overall, so we're talking about climate today, what our strategy is on climate, to begin with. And I saw Sri's comments in the chat, and I totally agree with, like, what is our strategy? Where do we think we need to be? What are our investments going to dictate? And doing, that's number one. Number two, a real cost benefit like you would for any other major investment. I think that's the new challenge statement that management teams are receiving. They're now expecting. And I think for whatever reason, this has been an area that we have not framed business cases in the same way we have any other financial investment that impact our stockholders. So I just think really looking for a refresh on strategy, looking for a real business case is a good challenge to management that may force some interesting conclusions, particularly in an environment where we're very focused on costs and other things, maybe more than other times.
Right. Thanks. Rich?
It's always a surprise for my clients when they realize the magnitude of what CSRD and ISSB are asking you to report. If I just use a quick analogy, the state of California rule is the size of a golf ball. The SEC is the size of a softball. And CSRD is the size of those balls that you balance on at the gym. CSRD is near, it's here. There's a lot of work to do. It's going to take time, it's going to take resources, and it's going to take money. You have to understand that. And I don't mean spending tons of money on a consultant or anything. You need to hire people, you need to train them, and you need to have the right technology. Consultants can be there always as a good interim solution to help train people up. Sometimes we stand these functions up for people and hand them over, or just provide a little technical assistance here and there. Aside from all that, the magnitude of the disclosures cannot simply be given to someone who already has a full-time job to say, just fit this in part-time. It's too much work. The SEC in California, really not a ton of work. If you've done a good climate assessment and have reasonably good greenhouse gas inventory, you're good to go. CSRD, you're going to need the help.
Okay.
That brings us to time.
Great. Well, thank you, Rich and Justin. That was amazing. You're a great team together, covering the rules and what board members need to know. So thank you all for joining. We hope you'll join another program in the future.